Mason's small ship drifted through the cold expanse of space, the vast blackness stretching endlessly around him. He had been alone for months, exploring the unknown sectors of the galaxy, far from the bustling human colonies. His mission was simple: gather data on uncharted planets for future exploration. Yet, despite the emptiness of space, Mason couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. The ship's hull creaked, and a sudden jolt threw Mason from his seat. His hand gripped the controls as the ship tilted. "Damn," he muttered, checking the instrument panel. A malfunction in the engine systems had sent him spiraling toward a planet. He had no choice but to attempt an emergency landing. The planet's surface was shrouded in thick clouds, but the ship's autopilot did its job, guiding the vessel through the atmosphere. Mason braced himself as the ship descended rapidly toward the surface. The ship's engines roared, straining to keep control. With a sudden crash, the ship slammed into the ground, sending a shockwave through the craft. He groaned, dazed but alive. After several moments, Mason managed to sit up and assess the situation. The ship was damaged, but not beyond repair. The outer hull was dented, and the engines were sputtering, but the cockpit still had power. He rubbed his face, cursing under his breath. A few hours of work would get him back on track, but that meant he had to find some spare parts. The planet's surface looked unfamiliar, barren, rocky, and covered in a dense fog. It was unlike any world he had ever charted before. Mason didn't want to take chances. He grabbed his tools, activated his suit's external oxygen supply, and prepared to leave the safety of the ship. He needed to search the planet for resources, especially for anything that could help fix the engines. The fog hung thick in the air as he stepped outside, the atmosphere cool and still. As he made his way through the rocky terrain, Mason's thoughts wandered. The isolation of space had started to weigh on him, and being stranded here only made it worse. He missed Earth. He missed seeing his friends, hearing the sounds of a bustling city, feeling a sense of purpose. He had signed up for this mission to escape the familiar, to discover the unknown, but the quiet had become deafening. It was easy to forget how lonely space could be. Mason pushed through the thick mist, the ground beneath his boots rocky and uneven. He wasn't sure how far he had walked when he heard a sound, soft at first, like the whisper of wind through the trees. But then it became clearer, a faint rustling noise coming from deeper within the fog. It didn't sound like any creature Mason had heard before. His hand instinctively went to the weapon holstered at his side. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. As he crept forward, the fog parted slightly, revealing a silhouette. At first, Mason thought it was a trick of the mist, a figment of his imagination. But as the figure came into focus, his heart skipped a beat. The figure was humanoid, but not entirely human. She was tall, with smooth, pale skin that seemed to shimmer under the dim light. Her hair flowed like liquid silver, and her eyes glowed faintly, not with any recognizable human color, but with a strange, ethereal hue. She was beautiful, but her presence felt unsettling. Mason's breath caught in his throat as she turned toward him, her gaze locking onto his with an intensity that left him frozen. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. She took a step closer, her movements graceful, almost otherworldly. "Who are you?" Mason finally managed to ask, his voice rough with the tension in the air. "What are you doing here?" The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stared at him, her expression unreadable. Mason's mind raced. He had encountered alien species before, but none like this. This wasn't a creature he could identify, not from any of the data he had gathered on his travels. Then, in a voice that sounded both familiar and strange, she spoke. "I thought our paths would never cross again." The words hit Mason like a physical blow. His heart skipped a beat. He stared at her, wide-eyed, struggling to comprehend what she had just said. There was something hauntingly familiar about her voice, something that tugged at his memory, but he couldn't place it. "Who are you?" he repeated, his voice softer now, a sense of disbelief creeping into his tone. The woman's lips curled into a small smile, her eyes glinting with an emotion that Mason couldn't understand. She took another step toward him, her gaze never leaving his. "You don't recognize me?" she asked, a note of sadness creeping into her voice. Mason's mind was spinning. Recognition tugged at the edges of his memory, but the fog of confusion prevented him from understanding. He searched her features, trying to make sense of the situation. Then it hit him, a memory from years ago, during a dangerous mission when he had encountered a similar alien species. He had been part of a rescue operation, and they had fought together to escape a deadly trap. But that had been years ago, on a different planet. Could it really be her? Mason blinked, his heart pounding as the realization slowly began to form. "Lyra?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman nodded, her smile widening. "Yes, Mason. It's me." Mason's mind reeled as everything clicked into place. Lyra, the alien warrior he had fought alongside, the one he had thought lost forever. Their paths had crossed once before, under dire circumstances, and he never thought they would meet again. But here she was, standing before him, as though no time had passed. Mason took a cautious step toward her, his heart racing. I thought you were gone. I thought we would never see each other again." Lyra reached out and gently touched his arm. "I thought the same, but the stars have a way of bringing things full circle." They stood there for a moment, the weight of the past hanging in the air between them. The fog had parted, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Mason didn't feel quite so alone. The fire crackled softly as Mason and Lyra sat near it, the shadows of the alien landscape stretching long and eerie around them. The night had fallen quickly, and with it the coldness of the unknown world seemed to press in on all sides. Mason stared into the fire, his thoughts scattered like the embers flickering in the flames. Lyra sat beside him, her pale skin glowing faintly in the dim light, her eyes reflecting the flames in an almost mesmerizing way. Mason had been alone for so long. He had gotten used to the silence of space, to the solitude of his mission. But now, with Lyra sitting beside him, memories he had buried long ago began to resurface. Her presence brought back everything: the fear, the adrenaline, the hope they had shared. He turned to her, his voice quiet. "I don't know how to process this. You were gone. I thought you were lost forever." Lyra didn't look at him immediately. Instead, she looked out into the darkened landscape, as if searching for something in the distance. Her expression was unreadable. After a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice soft but firm. "I thought the same about you," she said. "The last time I saw you, we were escaping that ambush. The last thing I remember is you covering my back. And then everything went dark." Mason's throat tightened. He remembered that moment too clearly. They had been caught in the middle of a brutal battle between factions on a distant planet. Lyra had been wounded, and as she tried to hold off the attackers, Mason had pulled her to safety. They had fought side by side, knowing it might be their last time together. The explosion that followed had separated them, and when Mason regained consciousness, he was alone. For years, he had believed she was dead, just another casualty of that war. "I thought you were." Mason started but stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence. "Dead." Lyra finished for him, her voice tinged with a sad smile. "I thought the same. For so long, I believed that you were gone, but I survived." Mason's heart raced. He hadn't expected to hear that. He hadn't known what to think when he saw her again. She had been part of his past, someone he had fought beside in a time of war, but he had never expected to see her alive again. "How did you survive?" Mason asked, his voice full of wonder. Lyra met his gaze, her eyes piercing through the darkness. "I was rescued by a different faction, one that believed in peace, not war. But that peace came at a cost. I was held in a hidden facility, kept in isolation for years, until I could escape, and then I searched for you." Mason listened intently, every word feeling like a small piece of a puzzle falling into place. He could hardly believe what she was saying. Lyra, the brave warrior who had fought so fiercely beside him, had been alone for years, searching for him. "You looked for me?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. Lyra nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I never stopped looking. I knew you were out there somewhere. And I couldn't give up, not after everything we went through." Mason looked at her in awe. The woman who had been his ally, his equal in battle, had never given up on him. It was something he hadn't expected. It was something he didn't deserve. "I never stopped thinking about you either," Mason said, his voice low. "I didn't know what happened after the battle. But I kept going. And I always hoped that maybe, just maybe, you were out there." Lyra reached out, her fingers brushing against his. The simple touch felt like a wave of warmth, a reminder of the connection they once shared. Her gaze softened, and for a moment, Mason saw something in her eyes he hadn't noticed before, something deeper than gratitude, something more powerful than the warrior he had once known. "What happened after the battle? After I was gone?" she asked. Mason paused, looking away for a moment. He was about to speak when the memories came flooding back. The pain, the loss, the years of uncertainty. He had tried to push it all aside, but the feeling of being alone had never left him. "I kept fighting, but not for the reasons I thought," he began. "I thought I was fighting for something bigger than myself, for humanity's future. But when you're alone, you start questioning everything. What's the point of all this if there's no one to share it with?" Lyra's eyes softened as she listened, her expression understanding. She knew what it was like to lose everything, to fight without hope. "I understand," she said quietly. "I felt the same way. But when I found out you were alive, it gave me a reason to keep going." The weight of her words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Mason had never expected this. He had never expected to find someone who understood him so completely, who had felt the same way he did all these years. Lyra turned her gaze back to the fire, her eyes reflecting the flames. "I've always believed that there's more to this universe than what we can see, and that no matter how far apart we are, the universe will find a way to bring people together when they need each other the most." Mason nodded, her words echoing in his mind. He had always believed in the randomness of the universe, that things just happened without reason. But sitting here, with Lyra beside him, he began to feel that maybe, just maybe, there was something more, something greater than the battles they had fought and the pain they had suffered. Perhaps their paths had crossed again for a reason. They sat in silence for a moment, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the air. Neither of them needed to speak. They both understood. The past was gone, and now they had a chance to rewrite their future, together. Mason finally broke the silence, his voice soft but resolute. "We had a lot of catching up to do." Lyra smiled, her eyes shining in the firelight. "Yes, we do." And for the first time in a long while, Mason felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The next morning, Mason awoke to the sound of the wind howling through the alien landscape. The sky above was a dull gray, with no sign of the sun piercing through the thick clouds. It was cold, and the mist still hung low to the ground. The planet was silent, save for the occasional rustle of movement in the distance. Mason stood up, stretching his stiff limbs, the events of the previous night still fresh in his mind. The reality of having Lyra back by his side felt surreal. He never thought he would see her again. And now, here they were, trying to survive together on an uncharted planet. Lyra was already awake, crouched near the fire, carefully tending to it. Her silver hair shimmered in the faint light, and the fire reflected in her deep, glowing eyes. She turned her head as she heard Mason approach. "Morning," she said with a soft smile. "We need to get moving if we're going to get your ship repaired." Mason nodded. The sooner they got the ship up and running, the better. Being stuck on this planet was no longer an option, especially after what happened last night. He was still processing the fact that he wasn't alone anymore, but they had a mission now, survival. His ship needed fixing, and with Lyra's help, he had a chance. "I'll gather supplies," Mason said. "Let's see if we can find what we need to fix the engine." Lyra stood up, adjusting the straps of her armor. "I'll go with you. We'll be stronger together." Her voice had a quiet confidence to it, one that Mason admired. She had always been a fierce warrior, but now she was more than just that. She was his partner again, and that brought a new sense of responsibility. The two of them moved out of the camp, walking carefully through the rocky terrain. The fog was thicker now, and Mason kept his hand on the hilt of his weapon, ready for anything. Lyra moved beside him with practiced ease, her eyes scanning the surroundings, alert to every noise and movement. They had both been trained to survive, but this planet felt different, almost like it was alive, watching them. As they walked, Mason couldn't help but notice how easily they fell back into their old rhythm. They didn't need to talk much, they just knew what the other was thinking. It was the kind of bond that could only be formed in the heat of battle, one that had survived even years of separation. "Do you think we'll make it out of here?" Mason asked, breaking the silence. Lyra glanced at him, her expression serious. "We have to. There's no other choice. We're both too stubborn to give up." Mason chuckled. True enough. They walked for what felt like hours, but the mist and fog made it difficult to judge the distance. The terrain was rocky, with jagged cliffs and deep crevices, and the air felt thick and heavy. There was a strange sense of quiet, as if the planet itself was holding its breath. As they rounded a corner, they came across a small clearing. Mason's heart skipped a beat. There, lying in the middle of the clearing, was an alien creature, one unlike anything he had ever seen before. Its body was large and muscular, covered in dark, scaly skin. It had 4 legs, each ending in sharp, clawed feet, and a long, twisting tail that flicked from side to side as it lay motionless on the ground. "Is it dead?" Mason whispered, instinctively reaching for his weapon. Lyra stepped forward cautiously, kneeling down to examine the creature. Her face was thoughtful, and her fingers hovered just above its side, feeling for a pulse. After a moment, she shook her head. "It's not dead. It's just injured," she said quietly. "This is one of the local predators. They're known to be territorial and dangerous, but this one's too weak to pose a threat right now." Mason felt a wave of relief. "That's good to know, but it still might be dangerous." Lyra stood up, her gaze scanning the area. "We need to keep moving. There are others out here, and they'll be drawn to this one's scent soon. If we stay too long, we might become the next prey." Mason nodded, and they quickly turned to leave, but just as they were about to move away, the creature let out a low growl. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make their hearts race. Lyra and Mason froze, their eyes darting around the clearing. "They've sensed us," Lyra muttered under her breath. Before Mason could react, several more of the creatures appeared from the mist, their glowing eyes piercing through the fog. They moved quickly, circling around the 2 humans, their claws scraping against the rocks. Mason tightened his grip on his weapon. He had been in battles before, but this was different. These creatures weren't just predators. They were intelligent. They knew exactly how to corner their prey. Lyra's eyes flashed with determination. "We need to fight our way out," she said, stepping forward. "Get ready." Without another word, she charged at one of the creatures, her movement swift and precise. She dodged its attack and struck at its side, her blade slicing through its tough skin with ease. The creature howled in pain but didn't back down. Mason quickly joined the fray, his own weapon flashing as he fought off one of the attackers. The creatures were fierce, but Mason and Lyra had fought worse. Mason felt a rush of adrenaline as he blocked another strike. "I don't know how many of them there are." "There are always more," Lyra called back, slashing at another creature. "But we don't have time to count." Mason swung his weapon at one of the creatures, narrowly missing it. They were surrounded now, and the creature's growls filled the air, making it hard to think. But there was no choice but to keep fighting. He glanced at Lyra, her face set in determination as she continued to battle with grace. Together, they pushed through, using their skills to fight back the creatures one by one. But there was no doubt. They were getting closer to being overwhelmed. The creatures were faster, stronger, and there were too many of them. Mason's heart raced, his thoughts spinning. How long could they keep this up? He had no idea. But there was one thing he was sure of. Lyra wasn't going to give up, and neither was he. The battle raged on, and in the back of Mason's mind, a question kept repeating. How long could they survive in a world where everything was out to get them? But for now, they'd fought on, side by side. There was no turning back. The sound of growls and scraping claws echoed through the misty forest as Mason and Lyra fought off the alien predators. The creatures were relentless, but Mason could feel his own strength faltering. He had never faced such a dangerous situation before. The creature's speed and strength were far beyond what he had encountered, and every movement felt like a battle against time. He knew they had to get out of this situation quickly or risk being overwhelmed. Lyra fought beside him with grace and precision, her movements fluid and controlled. Her alien agility made her a formidable opponent, and Mason couldn't help but feel a sense of admiration for her. She had always been strong, but now, with everything they had been through, there was something different about her, something that made her even more powerful than he remembered. After what felt like hours of constant fighting, the last of the predators finally retreated into the shadows, disappearing back into the fog. Mason and Lyra stood in the clearing, panting heavily, their bodies covered in dirt and sweat. Their weapons were stained, and the ground around them was littered with the remains of the creatures. "That was too close," Mason said, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. His heart was still pounding in his chest. Lyra nodded, her eyes scanning the area. "We can't stay here. The scent of the blood will attract more of them. We need to move now." Mason glanced around at the clearing. The fog had thickened, and the dense trees made it difficult to see much beyond a few feet. It was as if the planet itself was hiding secrets, secrets that they had yet to uncover. They had been on the planet for days now, and every time they thought they had a handle on their situation, something new and dangerous came their way. "Where do we go?" Mason asked, his voice tense. Lyra's eyes narrowed, her mind clearly working quickly. "There's an old outpost nearby, just beyond the ridge. It was abandoned long ago, but I remember it from my travels. If we can make it there, we'll have a chance to regroup and plan." Mason didn't hesitate. "Lead the way." Without another word, they began to move, keeping a steady pace but always on alert. The fog was thick, and every now and then they could hear the distant calls of creatures they had yet to see. Mason couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone, that something was watching them, even now. As they made their way through the dense forest, the air grew colder. The trees towered above them, their twisted branches reaching out like gnarled fingers, casting long shadows across the ground. Every step seemed to echo, and Mason couldn't help but feel the weight of the planet pressing in on them. The silence between the two of them felt heavy, as if both of them were contemplating the dangers they had just faced and the unknown that still lay ahead. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached the ridge. From the top, they could see the ruins of the outpost in the distance, an old crumbling structure half hidden by the overgrown vegetation. The outpost had once been a military base, abandoned after a series of failed expeditions. It wasn't much, but it was better than staying out in the open. "We're almost there," Lyra said, her voice low but urgent. "But we need to hurry. I don't like the way the air feels." Mason could feel it too. The atmosphere seemed thick with something, an unspoken tension that made every hair on the back of his neck stand up. He glanced around but saw nothing, yet the sense of being watched remained. As they neared the outpost, a sudden sound broke the silence. Footsteps. It wasn't just the soft crunch of leaves beneath their boots. These were heavy, deliberate footsteps, too close to be from the predators they had just fought off. "Lyra," Mason whispered, "we're not alone." Lyra's eyes narrowed, and she immediately dropped to a crouch, signaling for Mason to do the same. They both moved into the cover of the trees, their eyes scanning the area. The footsteps grew louder, and soon they saw the source, figures emerging from the mist. They were humanoid, but there was something different about them. They wore dark, high-tech armor that reflected the faint light of the surrounding fog. Their movements were precise, almost mechanical. "They're not from around here," Mason muttered, his hand instinctively going to his weapon. Lyra's eyes remained fixed on the approaching figures. "They're not. They're mercenaries, and they've been hunting me." Mason felt a chill run down his spine. The mercenaries had tracked them down, but for what purpose? And how had they found them so quickly? He had thought the planet's isolation would be enough to keep them safe, but clearly he had underestimated the dangers lurking in the shadows. "What do we do?" Mason asked, his voice low. Lyra took a deep breath, her expression hardening. "We fight. We don't have a choice." As the mercenaries drew closer, Lyra and Mason prepared themselves for another battle. Mason's heart raced, but he knew he had no time to doubt. He trusted Lyra, and that was all that mattered. They had fought side by side before, and they would do so again. But there was something different about these mercenaries. They were not like the predators they had faced earlier. These were soldiers, and they were dangerous. Mason had no doubt they were here for more than just a simple encounter. They were here for Lyra. "We need to move fast," Lyra whispered, her eyes never leaving the approaching figures. "They'll want to capture us, not kill us. But if they're willing to go that far, we have to be ready for anything." Mason nodded. "I'm ready." The two of them moved silently through the trees, staying low, watching the mercenaries' every movement. As the mercenaries drew nearer to the outpost, Mason and Lyra exchanged a look. It was time to act. In the distance, the outpost loomed, and as the mercenaries came closer to the entrance, Lyra and Mason made their move. They would fight, and they would survive. The air was thick with tension as Mason and Lyra crouched behind a cluster of boulders near the old outpost. The mercenaries were drawing closer, their footsteps echoing through the mist. Mason's heart pounded in his chest, his grip tightening on his weapon. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about keeping Lyra safe, protecting the bond they had rekindled after all these years. Lyra crouched beside him, her eyes sharp and calculating. She didn't look scared, not even a little. Her face was calm, but there was a fire in her eyes, a fire Mason knew all too well. It was the same fire that had made her an unstoppable force in battle. "We need to take them down before they reach the entrance," Lyra whispered, her voice low and controlled. "Once they're inside, it'll be harder to escape." Mason nodded. "Agreed. We take them by surprise." They watched as the mercenaries continued their steady march toward the outpost, unaware that they were being watched in turn. The sound of the fog swirling around them added to the eeriness of the moment, but neither of them faltered. Mason felt Lyra's eyes on him, and for a brief moment, he caught a glimpse of something that made him feel like everything was going to be all right. It was a quiet reassurance, something they had shared in battles before, a shared understanding that they were stronger together. Lyra's hand moved to her weapon, and Mason did the same. Without another word, they sprang into action. In one fluid motion, Lyra leaped from behind the boulders, her blade flashing as she slashed at the nearest mercenary. He never saw her coming. Her movements were like lightning, quick, precise, and lethal. The mercenary fell to the ground, his weapon clattering beside him. Mason followed closely behind, using the element of surprise to his advantage. He charged toward the next mercenary, sidestepping a bullet that flew past him. He fired back, his shot striking the mercenary square in the chest. The soldier crumpled to the ground with a grunt. Lyra was already moving toward another group of mercenaries, her agility allowing her to weave between their attacks. Mason couldn't help but admire her. She had always been a force of nature in battle. And now, it seemed like nothing could stop her, but there were more of them than Mason had expected. As the last mercenary fell to the ground, two more appeared from the shadows, flanking them on either side. These two were different, more heavily armored, their weapons larger and more advanced. They weren't the standard mercenaries Mason had faced before. These were professionals, and they had come prepared. "Mason," Lyra shouted, her voice urgent. "We can't keep fighting them like this. We need a plan." Mason glanced over at her, his mind racing. There was no way they could take on these two mercenaries directly. They were too well equipped, and Lyra was still recovering from the previous battles. He needed to think fast. He spotted an old ventilation shaft near the outpost's entrance, hidden just behind a pile of debris. It was narrow, but it might just be the escape they needed. "Lyra, over here," Mason yelled, pointing toward the shaft. Lyra wasted no time. She dashed toward Mason, her feet light on the ground as she moved. The two mercenaries saw them running, and they immediately began firing. But their shots went wide. Mason and Lyra were too fast, too unpredictable. They reached the shaft, and Mason quickly pried open the rusted cover. Lyra slipped inside first, and Mason followed closely behind, shutting the cover just as the mercenaries arrived. They could hear the pounding of the mercenaries' boots outside, but they were safe for now. The shaft was dark, the air stale with the scent of old machinery and dust. Mason and Lyra crouched low, moving quickly but silently. The shaft was narrow, but they managed to squeeze through, heading deeper into the complex. The sound of the mercenaries' voices echoed through the metal walls, but it was muffled, and they couldn't track their movements with the same precision they had outside. As they moved deeper into the old outpost, Mason's mind began to race. They had escaped the immediate danger, but this wasn't over. They were in enemy territory now, and they had no idea what awaited them in the depths of the outpost. The mercenaries were no longer their only problem. The outpost was filled with hidden rooms and corridors, and Mason had no idea where they would lead. "What now?" Mason asked, his voice low. Lyra paused, her eyes scanning the darkness. "We need to find a control room, somewhere we can access the security systems. If we can disable the mercenaries' communications, we'll have a chance." Mason nodded. "Lead the way." They moved through the shaft, following the twists and turns, trying to keep their presence undetected. Every corner they turned felt like a step deeper into the unknown, but there was no turning back. The only way out was forward. Finally, after what felt like hours of crawling through the narrow passageways, they'd reached a heavy steel door. Lyra tested the lock, her fingers moving expertly over the panel. Within moments, the door clicked open, and they slipped inside. The room was small but functional, filled with old monitors and control panels. Lyra immediately went to work, her fingers flying over the controls. Mason stood guard, his weapon ready in case of another surprise. "I'm accessing the system now," Lyra said, her voice steady. "I'll disable their communications. It'll give us a better shot at taking them out." Mason glanced at her, his admiration for her growing by the minute. She had always been quick with technology, but now she seemed even more determined than ever. He couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. "You've got this," Mason said, his voice full of confidence. Lyra's eyes flicked to him for a moment, and she smiled. "We've got this." With a few more taps on the console, the security system blinked to life, and the sound of a shutdown echoed in the room. The mercenaries' communications were cut off. They had no idea what had just happened. It was time to take the fight back to them. Mason and Lyra exchanged a look, their faces set with determination. They were going to make sure the mercenaries didn't get what they came for. Together, they would finish this. The dim light of the outpost flickered around Mason and Lyra, as they moved cautiously through the corridors. The air was cool, but it had a stale metallic scent, the remnants of a long-abandoned facility. The soft hum of old machines filled the silence as they navigated the maze of hallways, their footsteps quiet but deliberate. Mason kept his hand on his weapon, ready for anything. Lyra moved with the grace of a seasoned warrior, her eyes scanning every corner, every shadow, as they continued their trek deeper into the heart of the old outpost. The mission had shifted. It was no longer just about escaping the mercenaries. Now it was about survival and getting back to Mason's ship. They had to repair it and get off this planet. There was no time to waste. But despite the urgency of their situation, Mason couldn't help but feel a strange calm when he looked at Lyra. She was here. She had come back to him. The bond they had shared during the war hadn't vanished. It had only grown stronger, deepened by the years of separation and the battles they had fought. "What's the plan now?" Mason whispered as they came to a crossroads in the corridor. Lyra paused, her expression thoughtful. "We need to get to the central hub. There should be a control room there. And from there, we can access the outpost's schematics and maybe even the ship's docking bay systems." Mason nodded. He had no idea how Lyra had known all this, but it didn't matter. She had always been good with technology, and she was more than capable of handling whatever was ahead. As they continued their journey through the outpost, Mason couldn't help but think about everything they had been through. The time they had spent apart, the missions they had gone on, the danger they had faced. And yet, despite it all, he had never forgotten her. He had carried the memory of their time together in the war, that bond they had forged in the heat of battle. But now it felt different. There was something more to it, something deeper. They reached the central hub, a large, open room with high ceilings and walls lined with old machinery. The monitors were covered in dust, and some of them flickered intermittently, as if trying to come back to life after years of dormancy. Lyra approached the central terminal with ease, her fingers dancing over the worn keyboard. Mason stood watch, his eyes constantly shifting between the terminals and the entrance. He knew the mercenaries were still out there somewhere, likely regrouping and planning their next move. They had to be quick. The longer they stayed in the outpost, the more chances the mercenaries had to catch up with them. Lyra's voice broke through his thoughts. "I've got access to the ship's systems. We're in luck. There's a docking bay not far from here. If we hurry, we can get to it and repair the ship. It'll be our best shot at getting out of here." Mason felt a surge of relief. They were getting closer. But the danger wasn't over yet. They still had to make it out of the outpost alive. "How much time do we have?" Mason asked, his voice steady. Lyra glanced at the terminal, her eyes narrowing. "Not much. The mercenaries are on high alert. They'll be searching for us soon." Without wasting any more time, they moved quickly through the outpost, making their way toward the docking bay. The hallways seemed to stretch on forever, the silence oppressive, broken only by the sound of their footsteps. Mason's mind raced as they walked. He couldn't help but think of how different everything was now. The years they had spent apart had felt like a lifetime, but here they were, together again. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like they had a chance at something more than just survival. He couldn't put his finger on it, but something had shifted between them. When they reached the docking bay, Mason's breath caught in his throat. The ship was there, just as he had left it, though it was battered and broken from the crash landing. But it was his ship, and it was their ticket off this planet. The sight of it made everything feel real again. "We're here," Lyra said, her voice steady but tinged with relief. Mason nodded, his focus shifting to the ship. "We need to get inside and start repairs. I can handle the engine." "You?" "Let me help," Lyra interrupted. "I know my way around ships. We'll do it faster together." Mason hesitated for a moment, then nodded. He was used to working alone, but Lyra was more than capable. She had proven that time and time again. Together, they were unstoppable. They entered the ship, and Mason quickly got to work on the engine. his hands moving with practiced ease as he began repairing the damage from the crash. Lyra worked beside him, checking the systems and rerouting power to the critical areas. The ship hummed to life as they worked together, the engine slowly coming back online. As the ship's systems began to stabilize, Mason glanced over at Lyra. She was focused on her task, her brow furrowed in concentration. There was something about her, something that made him realize just how much he had missed her all these years. They had both been through so much, yet here they were, side by side again, fighting not just for survival, but for something more. Once the repairs were complete, Mason stood up, wiping the sweat from his brow. "We're good to go." Lyra smiled, her eyes shining with a quiet satisfaction. "You did it. We did it." Mason felt a weight lift off his shoulders. They had made it this far. But now, there was only one thing left to do. "Ready to leave this planet behind?" Mason asked, his voice low. Lyra nodded, her smile widening. "More than ready." As the ship lifted off the surface of the planet, Mason looked out the window at the vast expanse of space. They were free, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like they were going to be okay. Whatever the future held, he knew they would face it together. And for the first time in years, Mason felt hope stirring in his chest. With Lyra by his side, there was nothing they couldn't overcome. The universe was vast, and they had all the time in the world to explore it, together. The hum of the ship's engines was a comforting sound as Mason and Lyra drifted through space. The stars outside the cockpit window twinkled like distant beacons, and for the first time in days, the two of them could finally relax. The tension that had gripped them on the alien planet was gone, replaced by a calm that felt almost foreign after all they had been through. Lyra sat beside Mason, her eyes fixed on the stars, but her thoughts were clearly elsewhere. Mason glanced over at her, studying her features as the soft light from the control panel illuminated her face. She had always been beautiful to him, but now, there was something else, something deeper, a strength and determination that shone through every time she spoke, every time she moved. She wasn't just the warrior he remembered. She was more than that now. She had become a partner, a friend, and someone he could truly rely on. "You know," Mason said, breaking the silence, "I never thought I'd see you again after all these years." Lyra's eyes flicked to him, her gaze softening. "I didn't think I'd see you again either. I thought you were lost to me, just like everything else." Mason felt a pang in his chest. He had never fully understood how much losing her had affected him until now. All those years, he had believed she was gone, that they would never be able to pick up where they had left off. But now, sitting beside her, he knew that their bond hadn't faded. It had survived, buried deep inside them both, waiting to resurface when the time was right. "I never stopped thinking about you," Mason admitted quietly. "I carried the memory of everything we went through, the battles, the time we spent together. It never really left me." Lyra smiled softly, her eyes distant as if she, too, was reflecting on those memories. "I thought I had moved on, but the truth is, I never really did. I spent years looking for you. I couldn't let go of what we had." Mason's heart tightened as he looked at her. He had never truly understood the weight of her absence, how much it had affected her. But hearing her words now, he realized just how deeply their bond had run. They had been two people thrown into a war, fighting side by side, and in that time, they had created something unbreakable, something that distance and time had only made stronger. He reached over and took her hand, his fingers brushing against hers. Lyra didn't pull away. Instead, she gripped his hand tightly, her gaze softening as their fingers intertwined. "I don't ever want to be apart again," Mason said, his voice steady, but the weight of his words hung in the air between them. Lyra turned to face him, her eyes searching his face. "Neither do I." For a moment, they were silent, the weight of their shared history and the promise of their future settling over them. The ship continued its course through space, but Mason felt like everything had changed. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about something deeper, something worth fighting for. You know, I never really thought about what came next, Mason said, breaking the silence again. After all the battles, the missions, I didn't know what I was working toward. It was always just about surviving, just about getting through the day. But now, with you, I feel like I have something to live for. Lyra's eyes softened as she squeezed his hand. I understand. I felt the same way. But now, we have each other. We have a future. Mason's heart swelled as he looked at her, the woman who had once been a stranger, then a teammate, and now someone who meant everything to him. The thought of facing the universe without her was unimaginable. He knew that together, they could face anything. Where do we go now? Mason asked, his voice thoughtful. Lyra turned her gaze to the stars outside the window, a soft smile playing on her lips. Wherever the universe takes us, we've survived so much together, Mason. We've made it through things that would have broken anyone else. Now, it's our time. We can go anywhere, do anything. Mason nodded, a feeling of certainty rising within him. He didn't need to have all the answers. He didn't need to know exactly where they were headed or what the future held. All he knew was that with Lyra by his side, he was ready for whatever came next. The ship hummed steadily as it continued to glide through the cosmos. It was a small vessel, but to Mason and Lyra, it felt like their own little piece of freedom in the vastness of space. For the first time in years, Mason felt truly at peace. They had made it. Together, they had survived. And now they could start a new chapter of their lives. I've always wanted to see the stars up close, Mason said, his voice filled with a quiet excitement. But I think now I want to see them with you. Lyra's smile widened, her eyes sparkling. Then let's go see them. The universe is full of possibilities, Mason, and we have all the time in the world. The two of them sat there, hand in hand, watching the stars pass by as the ship flew deeper into the unknown. For the first time, Mason felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but with Lyra by his side, he knew they would face it together. And that was all that mattered. The universe was vast, full of challenges and mysteries, but Mason and Lyra had already proven that there was nothing they couldn't overcome. Together, they would explore the stars, one adventure at a time. And no matter where the future took them, they would never be apart again. In the distance, the stars twinkled brightly, their light reflecting the promise of a future full of hope, adventure, and the knowledge that they would never be alone again.